We had a recent comment on the somewhat peaceful protests organized by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders during the tumultuous decade of the 60s. And he observed, these were violent rioters, not peaceful protesters. Now, how violent were the protesters and how violent were the white supremacists they were confronting? And who was the most violent? Many older progressive white voters who are over 70 years old remember watching on television the events at Selma, Birmingham, and other civil rights protests demanding equal rights for black citizens. Martin Luther King insisted on peaceful protests. But what did the nation witness on their television sets? Viewers witnessed the brutality of police on horseback attacking the peaceful protesters with billy clubs at Selma. Viewers witnessed police attacking teenage black protesters with German shepherds and fire hoses in Birmingham. Viewers watched white supremacists burning Greyhound buses carrying black and white student protesters. In addition, they learned how white supremacists took the lives of several peaceful protesters at Selma and other places. These civil rights struggles are no longer remembered history for most of us, whereas the memory of the years-long riots that succeeded them remain. As for me, I am in my late 60s, and I have no memory of viewing these events on television. Indeed, what I remember was that John F. Kennedy's assassination completely usurped my Saturday morning cartoons. And I do not even remember seeing Martin Luther King's assassination on television. But I do remember the years-long violent riots that followed King's assassination. There was some loss of life during these riots, likely shared by both blacks and whites, as many businesses in the urban core were torched. In my city and many other cities, the price of commercial real estate near the urban core collapsed, and many businesses migrated to the suburbs in the following decades. Now, how many people lost their lives unjustly? During the 100 years between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the enactment of the major civil rights legislation of the 60s, there have been tens of thousands of blacks who have died during racial conflicts. Over 10,000 lynchings, mostly of blacks in the Deep South and Midwest, were documented by brave journalists such as Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the NAACP. Not all lynchings were publicized and counted, and many lynchings were public. The U.S. Post Office was compelled to forbid the circulation of postcards celebrating lynchings. And some lynchings were scheduled for Sunday afternoons in the town square so churchgoers could conveniently attend. As this is a distasteful topic, our reflection on lynchings alternates discussions of lynching incidents with discussions on civil rights. During World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged blacks to volunteer to serve in the Army, hoping the country would counter by making progress in civil rights. Blacks were disappointed in the summer of 1919 when race riots erupted in Tulsa and many other black cities. After black veteran soldiers returned home from fighting, demanding civil rights, race riots erupted where whites attacked and often burned black communities. Blacks had no legal recourse, and if they reported these crimes, they were often arrested even though they were the victims of the riots. And many whites were jealous of whatever financial success Negroes might achieve. As W.E.B. Du Bois's biographer David Levering Lewis states, there were race riots on a national scale. There was flight out of the South of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, the explosion of labor strikes from coast to coast shutting down shipyards, coal mines, steelworks, and the panic inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Each made race relations far worse than they already were. As was typical, there was no due process for blacks, no compensation, no protection from white rioters burning down black businesses, churches, and homes. And what opened my eyes to a greater appreciation of civil rights history? It was Doris Kearns Goodwin's description of why, during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused to support a federal anti-lynching bill, since the Southern senators controlling the Senate would refuse to support the war against fascism if anti-lynching legislation was passed at home. At first, I didn't understand how the federal government could pass legislation that directly determined local criminal laws. Then I realized this was a due process issue, where the federal government required that Southern sheriffs and Southern state attorneys would prosecute for murder the white supremacists who were suspected of lynching Negroes. FDR explained to a colleague that the Southerners, by reason of the seniority rule in Congress, are chairmen of the key congressional committees. If I come out for the anti-lynching bill, they will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. So I just can't take that risk. So FDR had a choice. He could fight the Nazis, or he could fight lynching, but he could not do both. And defeating the Nazis was an attainable goal. Now, were the 60s protesters violent? During the 60s, Martin Luther King believed seriously in nonviolent protests, sometimes canceling protests to prevent violence. Before the bloody protests at Birmingham, King organized workshops on nonviolent protests. The volunteers had to agree and sign this Ten Commandments pledge. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health, and follow the directions of the movement and the captain of the demonstration. And the purpose of the last point is to avoid having the protest spin off into violence. But Sheriff Bull O'Connor was more than willing to resort to violence when countering the peaceful protesters, including sicking police dogs and fire hoses on young protesters. There were many civil rights martyrs in Mississippi and Alabama during the time of the Selma marches that demanded that black citizens be permitted to register to vote. This was the most sensitive civil right of all, because if blacks did not have the right to vote, then they were denied representation and political power. 4 months later, in September 1963, the KKK detonated dynamite under the stairs of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham during Sunday school, killing 4 young black girls, including Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, ages 11 to 14, and injuring several dozen others. A white jury eventually convicted several of the perpetrators for murder, unlike other trials where white juries refused to rule against white defendants, no matter how heinous their crimes were against blacks. Now, Mississippi, like many southern states, was a one-party state, as only whites could join the Democratic Party. Blacks could not vote in the Democratic primary, where all elections were decided. Not only that, blacks were also prevented from registering to vote. In the Freedom Summer of 1964, many enthusiastic white and a few black college students traveled to Mississippi to assist in these voter registration efforts. And 3 volunteers, 1 black and 2 white Jews, disappeared when returning from registering voters in Mississippi. Their car was found, but they were not. Federal authorities became involved. LBJ ordered Navy divers to search the canals of Mississippi for bodies. They found 1 body, then another, of blacks who had been lynched, but none were the bodies of the 3 students. Finally, an informant came forward to tell them the story where they had been buried alive with a backhoe, and the full horrifying story is in our Yale lecture notes. During the marches on Selma demanding voting rights for blacks, Martin Luther King was able to restrain the violent impulses of the rising black power advocates in his own ranks. But white supremacists were not restrained. They decided to attack 3 white Unitarian ministers who ate lunch in a black restaurant. When they left, white thugs assaulted these ministers with clubs, and one of them died 2 days later in a hospital. Now, white supremacist violence helped ensure the passage of the voting rights bills. Police attacked nonviolent protesters on horseback with billy clubs. 3 houses of protest leaders were dynamited, although nobody was injured, and several bombs at the mayor's house were disabled. Most tragic was the death of a white Detroit mother and housewife who had volunteered to drive protesters to Selma from Montgomery, Alabama. As she was driving to Selma, white thugs drove up beside her and shot her in the head. There were many other violent incidents during these times of protests. Buses carrying black protesters were burned. Protesters were beaten while police watched. Sometimes police beat protesters. Police attacked teenage protesters with German Shepherd guard dogs, and many more violent incidents. But after he was assassinated in Memphis, Martin Luther King could no longer influence events. John F. Kennedy, although he championed civil rights, was unable to pass the first landmark civil rights bills. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, as the former Senate Majority and Minority Leader, was able to strong-arm multiple civil rights legislation through Congress. In the momentary aura after King's assassination, he was able to squeeze the last and most contested civil rights legislation through Congress. But there was no celebratory signing ceremony. The raging riots in multiple cities blazing on television screens across the country evaporated much of the support among the conservative white electorate. But LBJ also understood the root psychology of those who rioted. He explained to Kearns, "God knows how little we have really moved on this issue, despite all the fanfare. As I see it, I have moved this Negro from a D+ to a C-. He is still nowhere, and he knows it, and that is why he is out in the streets. Hell, I'd be there too. It was bad enough in the South, especially from the standpoint of education, but at least there the Negro knew he was really loved and cared for, which he never was in the North, where children live with rats and have no place to sleep and come from broken homes and get rejected from the army. And then they look on TV and see all the promises of a rich country, and they know that some movement is beginning to take place in their lives, so they begin to hope for a lot more. LBJ added, no matter how well you may think you know a Negro, if you really know one, there will come the time when you look at him and see how deep his bitterness is. And the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King lasted for years. Doris Kearns, in her biography of LBJ, notes that Watts was the precursor of more than 100 riots that stretched out for 3 long summers, leaving 225 people dead, 4,000 wounded, and $112 billion in property damage. LBJ was frustrated that these rioters would ruin the cause for so many decent Negroes, preventing further civil rights legislation. Now, early in his presidency, after signing the first Civil Rights Bill of 1964, LBJ was in a melancholy rather than a festive mood. Johnson told Bill Moyers, I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come. And we have several reflections in Doris Kearns Goodwin's biographies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, whenever my Democratic friends ask me to participate in local protests, I demur. What's the point? Public protests now have a bad name, and conservatives will not notice them, assuming they're only an excuse for violence and looting. The Civil Rights Memorial, sponsored by Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, celebrates 41 martyrs who died during the Civil Rights Movement between 1955 and 1968. And you might object that these liberals are not going to track the number of whites killed during these protests. And indeed, they wouldn't. The number could be similar, but I've not read any account of white supremacists losing their lives, and I am sure that some police died as the result of the violence. But when you include the number of black deaths during the lynching and race riots during the Jim Crow era, for every white who died, hundreds or possibly thousands of blacks died. Some of these were protesters, but many were murdered for the color of their skin. Many of the black deaths are forgotten in the sands of history. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his History of Black Reconstruction, quotes congressional testimony that confirms it was common after the Civil War for deep South white supremacists to murder and steal from uppity blacks without fear of consequences. And remember, more recently, there were no whites killed at the Charlottesville protests in 2017. But a white supremacist purposely drove his car into a crowd of civil rights protesters, injuring dozens of protesters and killing Heather Heyer, whom he ran over with his car. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.